Earlier this growing season, I posted about my plans for this self-supporting cattle panel trellis. Short version, it's a continuous 16-foot panel bent over and held in place with these pieces of chain that act as cross braces. In general, happy with it, love it, but I'm going to make one very big change next year, and I wanted to discuss the 3 reasons why I'm doing that. First, you might recall I very confidently stated that although I knew that these chains were going to prevent me from easily walking underneath the trellis, that this wasn't going to be a problem because I did not want to walk on the bed in any case, and because, and I quote, I'm just going to harvest things from the outside. Forgot one very important point as I said that, namely that gravity is very much in effect. And as I've been growing tromboncino squash for the first time this year on this trellis, it became abundantly clear that they were going to be hanging down from the inside face of this trellis, and if I wanted them to stay straight and not curl up, I needed to encourage that to happen. This meant harvesting from underneath. Same situation with beans. As I've grown my beans up and over the trellis, they've done great, but very naturally the pods, the part that I want to harvest, have been hanging down on the interior of this trellis and very much need to be harvested from underneath. Even in the case of tomatoes, I did, whenever I saw them, pull the tomatoes towards the outside of the trellis so that I could harvest them from outside, but inevitably several clusters did end up on the inside of the trellis and again had to be harvested from the interior. I ended up putting down boards on which I could walk to help at least distribute my weight when I was under here harvesting, but it was a serious game of calisthenics every time I went in here to get over that little fence and then over each and every single one of these chains. I'm ducking around like a ninja. It's not good. The second aspect of physics I forgot to consider was lateral force and wind. Well, this design did do an excellent job of holding up under the weight of all of the crops growing on it. The chains did a great job of preventing that spreading force, and the whole thing was nice and rigid. We had a heavy windstorm. Think tornado sirens are going off and we're in the basement. And because this was heavily loaded up with crops, it had essentially become a solid wall of vegetation. And in those heavy storms, there was a significant amount of force coming at it from the side, and the whole thing sort of leaned. You can see the result if I step back a bit. This whole thing is shifted dramatically to the right, and I had to add these T-posts to hold it up. And at this point, it's severely impinging on the tomatoes in the other growing bed, and it's leaning out into this walkway down the middle, making the whole thing really hard to navigate. The third and final reason for the change is simply I like the microclimate under here. Well, I didn't want to harvest from underneath. When I was forced to go in here and do that, I did notice on our hot, heavy days of summer that it's really much more pleasant underneath this trellis. The vegetation on it provides a ton of shade. It still allows a lot of air to come through, and overall it was significantly cooler underneath here than it was outside in the garden. I'd love to take advantage of that microclimate next year to help prevent the bolting of certain crops. Next year, my important modification is going to be, instead of having this as a narrower and taller design that spans only one of my 2 growing areas inside the bed, I'm going to do a wider stance to this and have it span the entirety of my 7-foot bed. It'll mean the whole trellis is a little shorter, but it's still enough head height for me to get underneath. I'm just shy of 5'8". If anything, it might make the harvest a little easier. Beans in particular, reaching up overhead and pulling those off is almost like painting a ceiling if you ever have done that. It's really non-ergonomic. Your arms get sore from the lack of blood flow, your neck gets all scrunched up. The whole thing being a little shorter doesn't fix that exactly, but it should hopefully make it a little less terrible. The wider stance should also make this whole design a little more stable to those lateral forces. I think next year I will simply have fewer of these cross-bracing chains, maybe one at each end to try and help prevent spreading, and it allows me to create that shady microclimate over the entire bed. In fact, I think I'm going to build more of these next year. I'm going to now place them across 2 beds entirely. The one where I grow my salad greens and the one where I grow my broccoli, so that I can create those nice shady microclimates as we get into the hotter part of the season. The great thing about these, spring crops can still get full sun while things like the squash or the tomatoes or the beans slowly work their way up and over it. By the time those crops are big enough to cast shade, the crops underneath are in pretty serious need of that cooling microclimate. I'm also going to put in a few smaller ones and have them span across the main walkway, and I'm going to use those to grow all of my drying beans. I'm happy at least with the general outcome of this. I think the concept holds. I just need to modify it a little bit going into next year to get an even better result. I'm going to keep doing these kinds of experiments. I'll keep sharing how they turn out later so you guys know the good, the bad, the ugly. I'd call this one a solid B+, and hopefully after my modifications next year I can get this one to a solid success. Hope that was helpful. Until next time, thanks.